It was close to midnight when Dr. James Chen finally stepped out of City General Hospital. The emergency room had been absolute chaos that day: 3 major car crashes, a building fire, and dozens of other patients who needed urgent care. His blue scrubs were wrinkled, and dark circles had formed under his eyes, but there was a small smile on his face. Despite the exhaustion, he had managed to save 3 lives today. The night air felt refreshing against his tired face as he started his usual walk home. Most of his colleagues thought he was crazy for not driving to work, but these quiet walks helped him clear his head after difficult shifts. Plus, taking the shortcut through Pine Grove Park cut his commute time in half. The park was peaceful at this hour, with only the soft glow of streetlights and the gentle rustling of leaves keeping him company. Dr. Chen was thinking about the little girl he had treated earlier. She had come in with severe burns from the building fire, but thanks to quick action and the dedication of his team, she would make a full recovery. Her parents' tearful thank you still warmed his heart. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the police car pulling up beside the park entrance. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and landing squarely on his face. "Stop right there," the taller officer called out. "Put your hands where we can see them." Dr. Chen froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He slowly raised his hands, confused but trying to stay calm. "Is something wrong, officers?" The second officer, shorter but stockier, approached him with one hand on his weapon. "We've had reports of a robbery suspect in the area. You match the description. ID now." "Of course, let me just." Dr. Chen carefully reached for his hospital ID badge, which was still clipped to his scrubs. "I'm a doctor at City General. I just finished my shift and I'm heading home. Here's my ID." The taller officer snatched the badge, examining it under his flashlight. His partner kept his eyes fixed on Dr. Chen's every move. "This could be fake," the taller officer said, his tone dismissive. "What's a doctor doing walking through a park at midnight?" Dr. Chen felt his confusion turning to frustration. "I always walk this way. It's my usual route home." "Look, I'm wearing hospital scrubs. I have my phone here with my schedule, and you can call the hospital to verify." "Stop moving," the stocky officer barked when Dr. Chen reached for his phone. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "I'm just trying to show you." "He's going for something," the stocky officer shouted, and before Dr. Chen could explain, both officers lunged forward. What happened next felt like a blur. Dr. Chen's phone clattered to the ground as the officers tackled him. His hospital ID went flying, landing somewhere in the darkness. He tried to explain, tried to stay calm, but the officers weren't listening. His face pressed against the cold pavement as they twisted his arms behind his back. "Stop resisting," they kept shouting, though he wasn't fighting back at all. "Please," he gasped, "I'm a doctor. Just call the hospital." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The last thing Dr. Chen remembered was a sharp pain exploding in his head, and then everything went dark. What none of them noticed was the silent witness to the whole incident. In the shadows of a nearby bus shelter, a man in worn-out clothes sat very still, holding up an old smartphone with trembling hands. The screen's glow illuminated his weathered face as he captured everything, his eyes wide with disbelief as he watched the officers attack an innocent man. This man, who most people walked past without a second glance, was about to become the key to changing everything. But for now, he just kept recording, his finger steady despite his racing heart, as the terrible scene unfolded before him. The next morning, the story of what happened to Dr. Chen would start spreading through the city like wildfire. But nobody, not the officers, not the doctor, and not even the mysterious witness, could have predicted how this one incident would end up transforming their entire community forever. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the hospital windows when Dr. Chen started regaining consciousness. His head was pounding, and every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or what had happened. Then the memories came flooding back: the park, the officers, the ground rushing up to meet his face. He tried to sit up but immediately regretted it. A gentle hand pressed against his shoulder, easing him back down onto the bed. "Take it easy there, James," a familiar voice said. It was Dr. Rita, one of his closest colleagues from the ER. Her usually cheerful face was etched with concern. How did I get here?" His voice came out as a raspy whisper. An ambulance brought you in about 4 hours ago, Dr. Rita explained, checking his vitals. The police said they found you unconscious in Pine Grove Park. They claimed you resisted arrest and attacked them during questioning. She paused, her eyes meeting his. But that doesn't sound like the James Chen I know. Dr. Chen tried to shake his head, but stopped when the room started spinning. I didn't. I was just walking home. They wouldn't listen. A nurse came in, carrying a small plastic bag. Doctor, we collected your personal belongings. Your phone screen is cracked, but it still works. Your hospital ID was found in the grass nearby. She hesitated before adding, and the police left this for you. She handed over a citation for resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. Dr. Chen stared at the paper in disbelief. His hands were shaking, not just from pain, but from anger and fear. Everything he had worked for, his reputation, his career, his life of helping others, was now at risk because of lies. Meanwhile, across town in the small 24-hour diner where he usually spent his mornings, Bob Williams was replaying the video on his phone for the 5th time. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he watched the horrifying scene unfold again and again. Most people saw Bob as just another homeless person, someone to avoid eye contact with on the street. What they didn't know was that he had once been a respected journalist before a series of personal tragedies left him without a home. He zoomed in on Dr. Chen's face in the video and suddenly remembered where he had seen him before. 3 months ago, when Bob had stumbled into the ER with severe pneumonia, this same doctor had treated him with kindness and respect. While other staff members had wrinkled their noses and kept their distance, Dr. Chen had sat with him, listened to his story, and made sure he got proper care. Bob's hands tightened around his phone. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew the risks. Going up against the police wasn't easy, especially for someone in his position. But he couldn't stay silent, not when he had the truth literally in his hands. Later that day, as Dr. Chen was being discharged against medical advice, he insisted, despite his injuries, the hospital staff gathered around him. News of what happened had spread quickly through the building. Nurses who had worked with him for years brought him clean clothes. The cafeteria staff who always saved him an extra coffee on night shifts packed him some food to take home. Even patients he had treated recently sent messages of support through their families. But outside the safe walls of the hospital, a different story was circulating. The police department had already released their version of events, painting Dr. Chen as an aggressive suspect who had brought the situation upon himself. Local news stations were running with the official police statement, showing Dr. Chen's hospital ID photo alongside headlines about violence against law enforcement. As he was wheeled out to his friend's waiting car, Dr. Chen caught sight of his reflection in the hospital's glass doors. His face was swollen, with dark bruises blooming across his cheek and eye. But what hurt more than the physical injuries was the feeling of helplessness. How could he fight against a system that seemed stacked against him? What Dr. Chen didn't know was that help was coming from an unexpected direction. In that same moment, Bob was walking into a small law office downtown, clutching his phone like it contained the most precious thing in the world. The young lawyer at the front desk initially tried to turn him away, but Bob stood his ground. "Please," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his former profession. "I have something you need to see. It's about what really happened to Dr. Chen last night." From that moment, the wheels of justice began turning in a direction no one had anticipated. The truth was about to come out, and it would shake the entire city to its core. The small law office of Wilson and Associates buzzed with unusual energy that afternoon. Attorney Lisa Wilson sat at her desk, watching the video on Bob's phone for the 3rd time. Each viewing made her stomach turn, but she couldn't look away. The footage was clear, steady, and showed everything, from Dr. Chen's polite compliance to the officer's unnecessary aggression. "Mr. Williams," she said, looking up at Bob, who sat nervously adjusting his worn jacket, "this video changes everything. But I need to know, why did you come to me specifically?" Bob cleared his throat. "I did my research. Before everything happened in my life, I was an investigative journalist. I know your track record. You've taken on similar cases even when everyone said you couldn't win. Dr. Chen needs someone like you." Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Chen was trying to rest in his apartment, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the incident. His phone kept buzzing with messages, some supportive from his colleagues, others disturbing. News of his arrest had spread online, and strangers were already judging him, calling him names, saying he must have done something to deserve it. His doorbell rang, making him jump. Through the peephole, he saw his neighbor Mrs. Lee, an elderly woman he'd helped with her medications many times. She was holding a container of homemade soup. "You need to keep up your strength," she said when he opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of his bruised face. "I don't believe what they're saying about you, not for 1 second. You're the one who checks on me every week, who makes sure I'm taking my heart medicine correctly. Bad people don't do things like that." Her simple act of kindness brought tears to his eyes. As they sat in his kitchen, Mrs. Lee told him how other neighbors were also questioning the official story. "We know who you are," she said firmly, "and we're not staying quiet about it." Back at the law office, Lisa was making calls. Her first was to a friend at the local news station, not the main channel that had run with the police statement, but a smaller independent outlet known for digging deeper into stories. "I'm sending you something," she told her friend. "But before I do, I need your word that you'll protect my source. He's vulnerable, and he's taking a huge risk." As she spoke, Bob sat in her office, sipping the first proper coffee he'd had in weeks. Lisa had ordered lunch for them both, and as they ate, he shared more about his past life as a journalist, about the stories he'd uncovered before his world fell apart. "Sometimes," he said, looking at his reflection in the office window, "you lose everything and you think that's the end. But maybe you're just being put in the right place at the right time to do something important." That evening, Dr. Chen received a call from Lisa Wilson. He listened intently as she explained about Bob and the video, about their plan to release it through trusted media channels. "But you need to be prepared," she warned. "Things might get worse before they get better. The police department won't take this lying down." She was right. Within hours of their meeting, Bob noticed a police car parked near the diner where he usually spent his days. Officers started paying extra attention to the areas where homeless people gathered, checking IDs, issuing citations for minor infractions. At the hospital, Dr. Chen's colleagues were feeling the pressure too. The police union had released a statement defending the officers' actions, and suddenly the hospital administration was being flooded with calls questioning whether they should employ a violent doctor. But something unexpected was happening too. As word spread through the hospital staff about what really occurred that night, more people started coming forward. A nurse recalled a similar incident with the same officers 6 months ago. A paramedic remembered them being unnecessarily rough with a patient. Each story was like a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Dr. Chen's neighbors started organizing, creating a support group that quickly grew beyond their building. Mrs. Lee's daughter, who worked in social media, helped create a hashtag that began trending locally. #StandWithDuction. The truth was building momentum, like a wave gathering strength before it breaks. Bob's video was safely copied and stored in multiple locations, waiting for the right moment. Lisa worked late into the night, preparing their legal strategy, knowing they had one chance to get this right. And Dr. Chen, despite his fears and doubts, found his resolve strengthening. Every supportive message, every kind gesture, every person who refused to believe the lies, they all reminded him of why he became a doctor in the first place: to help people, to stand up for what's right, to make a difference. As he finally drifted off to sleep that night, his ribs still aching but his spirit unbroken, he had no idea that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The video was about to go public, and the city would never be the same. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Bob's video hit the internet. The independent news station had done its job well, presenting the footage alongside a carefully researched story about Dr. Chen's reputation as a dedicated emergency room doctor. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Dr. Chen was having breakfast with Mrs. Lee when his phone started buzzing nonstop. "You need to turn on the news." Lisa Wilson's voice was excited when he answered. "It's happening." The video played on every local channel. The footage was crystal clear, showing Dr. Chen calmly presenting his ID, the officer's aggressive response, the unnecessary violence. But what caught everyone's attention was the audio. The video captured every word, every plea from Dr. Chen, every ignored attempt to explain himself. By mid-morning, the hospital's phone lines were jammed with calls, not complaints this time, but messages of support. Patients Dr. Chen had treated over the years began sharing their stories online. A mother wrote about how he had saved her child's life during an asthma attack. An elderly man posted about Dr. Chen staying past his shift to make sure his heart condition was properly diagnosed. The police department called an emergency press conference. The chief of police stood at the podium, looking uncomfortable as reporters shouted questions. "We are aware of the video circulating online," he stated. "An internal investigation has been launched. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending." But his words were drowned out by the crowd gathering outside the police station. Hundreds of people had shown up, hospital staff in their scrubs, patients Dr. Chen had treated, ordinary citizens shocked by what they'd seen. They carried signs reading "Protect our healers" and "Justice for Dr. Chen." At the law office, Lisa was fielding calls from major news networks, but her priority was protecting her clients. She'd moved Bob to a safe location, a small apartment owned by her cousin. "Your safety matters," she told him. "You're not just a witness anymore. You're the person who stood up when everyone else looked away." Bob sat in the apartment, watching the coverage on a borrowed laptop. For the first time in years, he felt like his old journalist self. But more than that, he felt human again. People were listening, paying attention, treating his words as valuable. His hands shook as he read the online comments, praising his steady camera work, his courage in coming forward. Meanwhile, the hospital administration called an emergency meeting. They released a strong statement supporting Dr. Chen, announcing that he would be welcomed back to work whenever he felt ready. The chief of surgery, Dr. Thompson, spoke to reporters. "Dr. Chen represents the very best of our profession. The way he was treated is not just an attack on him, but on every healthcare worker who dedicates their life to helping others." By afternoon, more stories began emerging. Other people came forward with similar experiences involving the same officers. A local database journalist discovered that multiple complaints had been filed against them over the past 2 years, all mysteriously dismissed without investigation. The city council announced an emergency session to discuss police oversight. The mayor's office released a statement promising reform. But for Dr. Chen, watching everything unfold from his living room, it all felt surreal. Mrs. Lee sat with him, making sure he ate and took his pain medication. "You see," she said, patting his hand. "The truth always finds its way out. It just needs good people to help it along." Later that evening, Lisa brought Bob to meet Dr. Chen in person. The moment was caught on camera by Mrs. Lee's daughter, the respected doctor, and the homeless man who saved his career, embracing like old friends. The photo would later become a symbol of the whole movement, printed in newspapers and shared thousands of times online. "I remembered you," Dr. Chen said, looking at Bob. "You came to the ER with pneumonia. You told me about your journalism days while I was treating you." Bob nodded, tears in his eyes. "You were the first person in years who actually listened to me, who treated me like a human being. When I saw what they were doing to you that night, I couldn't just watch. I had to do something." As they talked, more people gathered outside Dr. Chen's apartment building. Neighbors brought food, flowers, cards. Someone started singing, and others joined in. The impromptu gathering turned into a peaceful candlelight vigil. Local restaurants sent food. Children made get-well cards. The hospital staff organized a schedule to make sure Dr. Chen had support around the clock while he recovered. The community wasn't just angry about what had happened, they were determined to show that love could overcome hatred, that justice could prevail. As night fell, Dr. Chen looked out his window at the sea of candlelight below. "I never expected any of this," he said softly. "That's because you just see yourself as someone doing their job," Bob replied. "But to everyone else, you're proof that one person can make a difference. And now all these people are doing the same, standing up, speaking out, showing that every voice matters." The day was ending, but the movement was just beginning. Nobody knew exactly what changes would come, but one thing was certain: the city would never be the same. And it all started because 2 people, a compassionate doctor and a courageous witness, chose to stand up for what was right. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Chen's story had gone beyond local news. National media outlets were now covering it. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, but he only agreed to speak with reporters who also wanted to talk to Bob. "This story isn't just about me," he insisted. "It's about everyone who faces injustice and the people brave enough to stand up against it." Lisa Wilson's office had become command central for their growing movement. The walls were covered with sticky notes and timelines, mapping out similar incidents that people had reported. Her small team of lawyers worked around the clock, gathering statements and evidence. "Look at this," she told Dr. Chen one morning, spreading out documents across her desk. "In the past 3 years, there have been 27 complaints filed against these 2 officers. All of them were dismissed without proper investigation. But now people are coming forward, sharing their experiences." The police department was feeling the pressure. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation, not just into the incident with Dr. Chen, but into the officer's entire service history. The police chief held another press conference, this time announcing major changes to their training and oversight procedures. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. A young officer from the same precinct requested a meeting with Lisa. He arrived looking nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. "I can't stay quiet anymore," he told them. "Those 2 officers, they've been doing this for years. Some of us tried to report it, but we were told to mind our own business. They said speaking up would hurt the whole department." His testimony opened the floodgates. Other officers began coming forward, sharing stories of witnessing misconduct, but feeling powerless to stop it. The blue wall of silence was cracking and the truth was pouring out. Meanwhile, Bob had become something of a local hero. The same people who used to walk past him without a glance now stopped to shake his hand. Coffee shops offered him free meals. A local barber gave him a fresh haircut, but what meant the most to him was how people actually listened when he spoke. "It's not about me," he kept saying. "I just did what any decent person would do." The real story is about how one small action can start something bigger than yourself. The hospital welcomed Dr. Chen back with open arms. His first day back at work, he found his locker decorated with cards and his favorite coffee waiting at the nurse's station. But more importantly, he noticed how his experience had changed things. Police officers bringing in suspects for medical clearance were more respectful. Hospital security had revised their protocols for handling confrontations. One evening, as Dr. Chen was finishing his shift, a young boy came into the ER with his mother. The boy had fallen off his bike and needed stitches. As Dr. Chen cleaned the wound, the boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you the doctor from the video?" he asked. "The one who stood up to the bad police officers?" Dr. Chen smiled gently. "I'm just a doctor trying to help people. But you know what? Sometimes being brave means speaking up when something's wrong, even if you're scared." The boy thought about this while Dr. Chen finished the stitches. "Like how Bob helped you?" he asked. "Exactly like that," Dr. Chen replied. "One person doing the right thing can inspire others to do the same." The city council meetings became packed with citizens demanding change. People from all walks of life shared their stories, not just about police misconduct, but about the need for better understanding between law enforcement and the community. Mrs. Lee organized a neighborhood watch program that worked alongside reformed-minded police officers. The hospital started a community outreach program, bringing healthcare services to underserved areas. Bob used his journalism skills to help document these changes, creating a blog that tracked the progress of reforms. One particularly meaningful development came when a group of police officers approached Dr. Chen with an idea. They wanted to create a joint training program where medical professionals and law enforcement could learn from each other. The goal was to improve how officers handled medical emergencies and how healthcare workers dealt with security situations. "We need to understand each other better," one officer explained. "What happened to you should never happen to anyone else." The internal investigation was nearing its conclusion. The 2 officers had been fired, and criminal charges were being considered. But for Dr. Chen, the most important outcome wasn't about punishment, it was about change. "Every system can be improved," he told a community meeting, "but it takes everyone working together. It takes courage to admit when things are wrong, and even more courage to try fixing them." Late one night, after a long shift, Dr. Chen found Bob waiting outside the hospital. They often met like this now, sharing coffee and talking about the changes they were seeing in the city. "You know what's funny?" Bob said, watching ambulances come and go. "People keep calling us heroes, but we're just two guys who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe it was the wrong place at the right time." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the best changes, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The night shift was beginning, and somewhere in those streets, people were working to make things better. One small action at a time, one voice speaking up, one person choosing to do what's right. That's how real change happens. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in the park. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the courthouse as Dr. Chen straightened his tie. The day they'd all been waiting for had finally arrived. The two officers would face both criminal charges and a civil rights lawsuit. Lisa Wilson had prepared them well for this moment. "Remember," she told Dr. Chen and Bob as they walked up the courthouse steps, "your honesty is your strongest weapon. Just tell your story exactly as it happened." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Hospital staff filled several rows, wearing their scrubs in solidarity. Mrs. Lee sat with her neighbors, clutching her daughter's hand. Even some police officers were present, the ones who had come forward, who had chosen truth over silence. The proceedings began with the security footage from nearby buildings being played alongside Bob's video. The combination painted an undeniable picture of what had happened that night. The prosecutor presented evidence of the officers' past misconduct, supported by testimony from their former colleagues. When Dr. Chen took the stand, he spoke not with anger, but with clarity and purpose. He described his work at the hospital, his daily routine, the lives he'd helped save. Then he recounted that night, every detail still fresh in his memory. "What impact has this incident had on your life?" the prosecutor asked. Dr. Chen looked around the courtroom before answering. "At first it broke something in me, my trust, my sense of safety. But then something unexpected happened. I saw how one terrible event could lead to positive change. I saw my community come together. I saw brave people like Bob stand up for what's right." Bob's testimony came next. Gone was the nervous, homeless man who had first walked into Lisa's office. In his place sat someone who had found his voice again. He spoke with the confidence of his former journalist days, describing how he had witnessed the attack and why he chose to record it. "Dr. Chen had treated me with dignity when I was at my lowest," Bob explained. "When I saw him being attacked, I knew I had to do something. Sometimes the right thing to do is simply to bear witness, to make sure the truth can't be buried." The defense tried to question Bob's credibility, bringing up his homeless status and personal struggles, but Bob remained calm, his voice steady. "Yes, I lost everything once, but I never lost my sense of right and wrong, and I never lost my ability to tell the truth." During a break in the proceedings, Dr. Chen noticed a young police cadet sitting alone in the hallway, looking troubled. He sat down next to her. "I'm training to be an officer," she said quietly. "I want to help people, to serve my community. But after everything that's happened, I'm wondering if I'm making the right choice." Dr. Chen thought carefully before responding. "The world needs good people in every profession. What happened to me was wrong, but it's people like you. People who want to do the right thing, who will help make sure it doesn't happen again." Back in the courtroom, the evidence continued to mount. Internal affairs investigators presented their findings, years of covered-up complaints, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, reports that had been altered. The officers' own body cameras, which they had failed to turn off, captured their conversations before approaching Dr. Chen. The footage revealed their prejudices, their casual discussion of how to provoke a confrontation. It was damning evidence of a systemic problem that had gone unchecked for too long. As closing arguments approached, the impact of the case was already being felt beyond the courthouse. The police department had implemented new training programs focusing on de-escalation and community relations. The hospital had established better protocols for documenting and reporting incidents of abuse. Community oversight boards were being formed, giving citizens a voice in law enforcement policies. Lisa's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. "This case is about more than one incident or two officers," she told the jury. "It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where power can be abused without consequences? Or do we want to be a place where justice applies to everyone equally? The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. The officers were found guilty on all counts. But perhaps more importantly, the civil case led to major policy changes. The settlement money would go toward establishing a community center that would house both medical services and police outreach programs. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Dr. Chen and Bob. "What's next?" someone asked. Dr. Chen looked at Bob, then at the crowd of supporters around them. "This was never about revenge," he said. "It was about making things right. Now the real work begins, making sure these changes last, building bridges between law enforcement and the community, helping people understand each other better." Bob nodded, adding, "Sometimes justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about creating something better from what went wrong." As they walked down the courthouse steps together, the doctor and the former journalist, surrounded by their community, they knew this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The hard work of real change was just starting, but for the first time in a long while, it felt possible. That evening, Dr. Chen returned to his ER shift. As he walked through the hospital doors, he passed a new sign that read, "Healing happens when we work together." It wasn't just about medicine anymore. It was about healing the whole community, one small step at a time. 1 year later, Dr. Chen stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd gathered for the grand opening of the Community Health and Justice Center. The modern building gleamed in the morning sun, its glass walls reflecting the city skyline. What had started as a tragedy had transformed into something remarkable. A year ago, he began, his voice carrying across the attentive audience. "I was just a doctor walking home from my shift. Today, I'm still a doctor. That's who I'll always be at heart. But now I'm part of something bigger, something that proves how a community can turn pain into progress." The center was unlike anything the city had seen before. One wing housed a free medical clinic where doctors and nurses volunteered their time to help those who couldn't afford healthcare. Another section was dedicated to police community relations, with meeting spaces for dialogue and training rooms for joint programs. Bob, now the center's community outreach director, sat in the front row wearing a crisp new suit. His blog documenting the city's changes had grown into a full-fledged community newspaper, giving voice to stories that might otherwise go untold. His eyes were bright as he watched his friend speak. "This center exists because of countless people who refuse to let hatred have the last word," Dr. Chen continued. "It exists because a man with nothing but a phone and his conscience chose to stand up for what's right. It exists because police officers had the courage to speak out against wrongdoing in their own ranks. It exists because a community decided that healing is more powerful than hurt." The crowd included faces that had become familiar over the past year. Mrs. Lee, who had started a senior citizens advisory board for the police department. The young police cadet from the courthouse, now a full officer who taught de-escalation techniques to her colleagues. Lisa Wilson, whose law firm had created a special unit dedicated to civil rights cases. The changes in the city were visible beyond the new building. Police officers regularly participated in community health fairs, learning about medical issues that might affect the people they encountered. Medical students went on ride-alongs with officers, gaining understanding of law enforcement challenges. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a spirit of cooperation. Dr. Chen invited Bob to join him at the podium. The two men, once strangers brought together by a moment of crisis, now stood as symbols of how unexpected friendships could bridge deep divides. "A year ago," Bob said, adjusting the microphone, "I was invisible. People walked past me like I didn't exist. But Dr. Chen had seen me when I needed help, so I knew I had to see him when he needed help. What I learned is that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter who we are or what we've lost." The ceremony continued with tours of the facility. In the medical wing, volunteers showed off the modern examination rooms and the pharmacy stocked with donated medications. The community center buzzed with activity, youth programs, senior citizens meetings, support groups, and educational workshops, all running simultaneously. The police chief, newly appointed after the previous one's resignation, spoke about the department's transformation. "We're learning that true strength comes from accountability, not authority," she said. Every officer now undergoes enhanced training that includes medical awareness and community engagement. We're seeing fewer confrontations and more conversations. Later that afternoon, Dr. Chen took a break from the celebrations to do what he loved most, treating patients. As he worked in one of the new clinic rooms, he heard familiar voices in the hallway. Looking out, he saw Bob giving a tour to a group of journalism students, teaching them about ethical reporting and the importance of bearing witness. In another room, a police officer was teaching basic first aid to a group of neighborhood kids, showing them how to help others in an emergency. The officer caught Dr. Chen's eye and nodded. It was one of the young officers who had testified during the trial. As evening approached, the center remained full of activity. A community dinner was being served in the main hall, prepared by local restaurants that had supported their cause from the beginning. People from all walks of life sat together, sharing meals and stories. Dr. Chen found himself sitting with Mrs. Li and her family. "Look at what you started," she said, gesturing at the bustling room. "All because you refused to let bitterness take root." "I didn't start this," he replied modestly. "We all did. Everyone who chose hope over hate, healing over hurting." As night fell, the center's lights glowed warmly, a beacon in the city. Tomorrow, it would open its doors for its first full day of operation. There would be challenges ahead, old habits to overcome, trust to rebuild. But something fundamental had shifted in the community. The last visitors were leaving when Bob found Dr. Chen in his office, looking out the window at the city lights. "Penny for your thoughts?" Bob asked. Dr. Chen smiled. "I was just thinking about that night in the park. How the worst moment of my life led to all of this. How sometimes it takes darkness to show us where we need to bring light." Bob nodded, understanding. "You know what I've learned? Change isn't about big gestures or dramatic moments. It's about small choices, choosing to see each other, to help each other, to stand up for what's right. One person at a time, one day at a time." Together, they walked through the quiet building, turning off lights and locking up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, they could take pride in knowing that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a prescription. It's found in the healing power of a community coming together, choosing to write a new story for itself.